Welcome to the inaugural episode of Social Theory Shorts. In this first series, I'll be focusing on Erving Goffman, a giant in the field of sociology who was also influential in disciplines like anthropology, psychology, and communication studies. Goffman coined a lot of concepts that you might have heard of, like social stigma, impression management, or presentation of self. It's easy to find explanations of these concepts, but they're often taken out of context of his overall project. So in this first video, I'll be talking about one of the ways Goffman was reacting to the prominent disciplines around him. And the best place to start might be what he called the neglected situation. But before we jump in, I'd like to think about how the basic project of this mid-20th century sociologist might still be relevant today.
I believe people skills can be learned just like math or science.
In our studies, if people stand like Wonder Woman for 2 minutes, their testosterone increases significantly, their cortisol drops significantly, they are more risk-taking, and they are more likely to do well in very stressful situations like interviewing for a job.
When you smile, you don't only appear to be more likable and courteous, but you actually appear to be more competent.
Here's your prescription from Dr. Love. 8 hugs a day. We have found that people who release more oxytocin are happier. And they're happier because they have better relationships of all types. Dr. Love says 8 hugs a day.
If you're skeptical of these sorts of claims, you're not alone. The idea that you can manipulate your neurochemistry through something like a hug or a smile stretches current research beyond credulity. And John Oliver points this out in a must-watch takedown that I'll link to here. But even without considering the scientific literature, just taking the perspective of a normal person who does things like hug or smile or gesture all the time, isn't there something intuitively off about the way these folks make sense of our behavior? Like, we all know a smile doesn't always mean we're happy, or a hug isn't always about love. Goffman is going to draw from observations of people going about their everyday lives to say that maybe this whole communication thing is more complicated than these scientists, or in his day sociologists, are giving it credit. His consistent emphasis over his career is that to understand how society works, we need to pay attention, close attention, to mundane, everyday interactions in language and approach them as if they have their own sort of logic. When Goffman was writing in the 60s and 70s, a major current in sociology was concerned with coming up with statistical models for macro-level social structures. So things like race or socioeconomic status could be correlated with educational attainment, and bam, you have a snapshot of the structure of American society. But Goffman had an objection to this, and that was that it treated the actual experience of living in a society, visiting a bureaucratic office, going to church, buying toothpaste, as an afterthought, or maybe even entirely determined by your place in this social structure. Let's take as an example forms of address in U.S. society. Whether you call someone by their first name or by their last name and some sort of title like Mr., Ms., Doctor, the classic approach to this issue would be to say, okay, calling someone by their last name and a title is a sign of respect. So by examining whether or not people use first name or last name and a title, we can say something about their relative status in the structure of American society. So if they're friends or equals, they might use first names. If they are strangers or of unequal status, like employee and boss, for example, they might use Mr. or Ms. And maybe we could even come up with an elaborate flowchart to determine whether or not someone would use first or last name based on their relative position in the social structure. But Goffman points out that there are problems with this approach. Think of the classic example of a teacher who uses first names with students, but then switches to last name and a title to scold someone. Is this switch because the teacher and the student's roles or relationship has changed, those fundamental inputs on the flow chart we just saw? Not likely. It's more that the teacher is using the title to create a temporary effect of seriousness or authority in the classroom. And we can even imagine them using the same title to create a different sort of effect by, like, for example, pretending to scold a student just to joke around. Goffman would argue that instead of seeing our behavior as determined by rules laid out by society, we should instead think of things like names, or really all language, as interactional tools for acting out, or maybe even temporarily subverting, various everyday roles and hierarchies. Returning to the claims about hugging and gestures from the beginning of the video, we can now see that they tend to fixate on an idealized, out-of-context image of interactions like a hug, not unlike the macro-level sociologists that Goffman critiqued. But Goffman might ask, what about a hug like this? Here we can see that Cameron Tucker from Modern Family doesn't want to be in the hug, but also he doesn't create a scene by refusing it. It's easy to imagine him instead making eye contact with the people around him, having a whole back-channel conversation about his displeasure with his body language and facial expressions, while perhaps hiding his feelings from the person who's hugging him. This is not, of course, to say that there aren't various neurochemicals here acting on the hugger and the huggee. But Goffman's critique is that by making generalized statements about something like a hug or a title, we lose sight of how much the meaning of our actions depends on the immediate context of the social situation that we're in.